everyone. Welcome to our final session, and welcome to those joining us on Zoom and on the video later. I think you guys are in for a really great discussion. As always, please silence your phones. I would like to introduce our moderator for this session, Sharon Lerner. Sharon covers health and the environment at ProPublica, and she has reported extensively on the pollutants known as PFAS. She has also reported personally in East Palestine. Sharon, welcome.
Thank you. And hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yep, good. It is an honor to be here today and to talk with all these fine folks about a really important disaster that befell East Palestine in February. So, as most of you probably remember, East Palestine is a small town on the border between Pennsylvania and Ohio. And a train derailed there in February that contained all sorts of toxic substances, including vinyl chloride. So the train derailed February 3rd, I believe, and 3 days later, should we wait until people are coming in? Anyway, shortly 3 days after the train derailed, a decision was made to basically vent and burn, to release the vinyl chloride from 5 of these cars and ignite it. And as you probably saw on TV and on social media, this created a giant fireball that rose over the town and left everybody in the town and in communities nearby and up and down that river in a quandary. No doubt you've heard about some of the health issues that people there have complained of since then: wheezing, headaches, brain fog, nausea, nosebleeds. And these are symptoms that can be related to chemical exposures, but it turned out that reporting on this and reporting on everything that's happened there in this past 8 months is super complicated. It's not, just, exposure equals symptoms. It turns out it is a disaster environmentally. It turns out to be a disaster health-wise, and also a super, super complicated story to report. So a big issue, obviously, and relevant to you guys, is covering the science. There's a lot of science in terms of the testing, what was released from this fireball, where did it go, where did the chemical pollution go, what are the health effects of the chemicals that were released, do those health effects that are anticipated match up with what people are experiencing? How do we know the levels of exposure? How do we know about what levels of contamination are in people's homes? Those kinds of things. But because there was so much confusion, and remains to this day so many unanswered questions, part of the problem that compounded the first derailment and then the explosion on top of that was mistrust of authority figures. There are, so many different branches of government that were represented there: the US EPA, the environmental state organizations from Ohio and Pennsylvania, local disaster responders, and there was a lot of mistrust of them. And then, by extension, in a way, mistrust of the reporters who are trying to convey information from these authorities to the public. So it's been 8 months since the disaster, almost exactly. But it's very clear that this story is not over. What the people who live there are continuing to go through remains a really important issue for all of us to think about and to try to cover, despite all the challenges. A lot of the people who remain there, some people have left, some people are still there and feel that they've been affected, their health is affected, and they remain there. Some people, many people are still living in hotels outside of town. So I think one of the things I'm hoping that we can talk about today is how we all can continue to pay attention to what happened there and the aftermath, the ongoing aftermath. So I'm going to introduce all of our panelists one by one, and they will speak a little bit, and then I will ask some questions, and then we will invite questions from all of you on this topic. Our first speaker is Andrew Welton. Andy is an environmental engineer and a professor at Purdue University. And in the wake of the East Palestine disaster, Andy went to East Palestine with a team of volunteers. I actually met with him there at one point. And he has been a real advocate. I think that's fair to say. He's provided testimony to Congress about what he saw there and his own testing. And he has remained involved months and months later. And I think his science is still unfolding. Even as the disaster is still unfolding, his science is still unfolding. So let's hear from Andy. Andy, do you want to be there or do you want to be here? Okay, we'll try.
So thank you, Sharon, for the introduction. And I'm going to show something on the screen. I promise I have 5 slides. This isn't a lecture. So the work that we've done has been funded by crowdfunding, the National Science Foundation, United for East Palestine, which is a pop-up community group that started the day of the disaster, and this group called the Open Collective. I'll tell you, when we got involved in February and we drove into the area, we had no funding. So we went in just to help. A lot of what I do is I work with communities that either call us in by government agencies, whether they be local agencies, state agencies, or federal agencies, to understand, what chemicals should we look for, where do the chemicals go, how do you return homes and infrastructure to safe use, and what are the chemical exposures. And so we've been involved in East Palestine, chemical spills before, as well as the Maui wildfires and others. And so as Sharon mentioned, many of us have seen these AP images and videos on TV where the open burn occurred on February 6th, and the governor of Ohio got on TV and showed everybody this map on the right, saying that most of the chemical is going to move southeast. There's a creek that goes right through town, and some of the rail cars actually fell into the creek, the ones that were leaking, and the liquid in the creek from these rail cars went west and then went south. In the evacuation zone, people were told to basically get out of the blue zone. And then if you're between 1 and 2 miles away, stay still and shelter in place. What we do know, though, is based on field evidence, is that the chemical plume actually didn't follow this map. It actually spread out to the north, south, and elsewhere, and went actually into the shelter-in-place zone and past that as well. So what we've been doing is looking at understanding chemical fate and atmospheric modeling to understand the initial chemical fate of the open burn, creek water sampling, chemical biodegradability in the creeks, sorbent pad effectiveness, these little white mats on the creeks, do they suck up chemicals or not? Evaluated the impact of aeration, and I'll show you a picture in a second about what that means. And then we also went to buildings and looked at building owner and experiences, many of them reporting symptoms, drinking water well sampling. We actually wiped the exterior of some buildings, and this was solely because the residents asked us to. We had never done that before. So a lot of what we did was created on the fly. And we initially went in just to do drinking water well sampling. So this is a video of what we saw 3 weeks after we showed up. So when we showed up 3 weeks after the disaster, we were told that the contamination was contained at the derailment site, and it wasn't. There was open sheens flowing around in many of the creeks, at least 2 miles downstream. and you could smell this really acrid odor. And the creeks, remember, go right through the middle of town. We also saw these types of activities going on where they were sucking out the contaminated water and they were blowing it into the air. And this was meant to strip the heavily, volatile organic compounds that are like gasoline. Like if you leave gasoline out there, the vapors will go into the air. It wasn't gasoline compounds, but they were like that. And so they were basically blowing it into the air. Workers, contractors, and government workers, CDC employees and East Palestine municipal employees got sick. Residents became sick and visitors became sick. Norfolk Southern's air testing devices that they used were actually incapable of finding all the indoor air acute health risks. So they were giving clean bill of healths to these buildings that they were sending people back into, and the people that were going in were getting sick. And that's because the devices that were approved for use were incapable of finding the contamination. Norfolk Southern also issued indecipherable well water testing results to households. So some people had city water, and there was a well field associated with that, and other people were on private wells that were right next to these creeks. So the water could possibly come from the creek, go into that well, and get sucked up, and people would drink it. The agencies were testing once a month to see what contamination was there, but Norfolk Southern was issuing these documents to households that were indecipherable. And I can talk more about that if you'd like. And so this is kind of the big picture. So anytime you respond to a chemical disaster, you need to understand what are the chemicals you're looking for, where did they go, where are they now, and then how do you decon the buildings to get it out. And basically what we saw here was that there are a number of different exposures of workers and people in their homes well after the open burn. There were actually creeks that went directly underneath people's homes in big concrete old culverts that were all cracked. And the chemicals actually volatilized from the water and went up into their buildings after they were given a clean bill of health for their buildings. And so that's it. Just wanted to show you kind of this perspective on the science. There's a lot of great researchers that are doing work on this space, and they're picking off different parts of this story, but we'll be submitting a paper soon. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. So our next speaker is Stephanie Chekalinsky, who is a reporter, and she oversees the Health and Engaged Journalism team for Idea Stream Public Media, which is an NPR affiliate in Northeastern Ohio. She's an experienced data journalist, shoe leather reporter, editor, and team leader. And you are a reporter now too, right? Reporter and editor?
I got promoted, so I'm the.
Does that mean editor or reporter?
I'm the deputy editor of news now.
Okay, wow. Okay, good.
Thank you.
So welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you.
You want to stay down there?
Yeah, I can stay right here. So I don't know about how many of you have ever been in a newsroom when an event like this happens, but they happen pretty regularly, and experienced journalists, know how to respond to things like train derailment. They're common, and over the course of a career, you'll respond to probably quite a few, especially if you're in local news. So our newsroom is small. We have 11 reporters covering 22 counties, including the county that includes East Palestine, and 2 health reporters. And on February 3rd, it was like right before 9 o'clock, right? That's when this train derailment happens. That's a Friday night. So we don't have like a weekend crew. We have a reporter and an editor who are on call. So, a train derailment, that's kind of common. It's probably not even really newsworthy. There are so many of them. So the reporter and editor go to bed, and the next morning they wake up, and the heat on this one is sort of starting to ratchet up. And by Monday morning, February 6th, that's my birthday, we are all Googling vinyl chloride. Because most journalists, especially people who work in local news, are generalists. My degree is in English literature. We are not familiar with vinyl chloride. So we're all Googling a lot. right? We don't have your phone number. But it's up to us to cover this. And now there's a giant fireball because they've decided that they're going to take roughly 116,000 gallons of vinyl chloride, and correct me if I'm screwing up the description, but they basically vent it into like a ditch and light it on fire. So that's about it's equivalent of about 66 above ground 8-foot swimming pools, right? And there's just plumes going up in the air, and we're Googling vinyl chloride, right? So we send a reporter out there, and we're in the community, and it's a rural community, and we're about an hour and a half, our headquarters is about an hour and a half away. And even though we're the local affiliate and we're responsible for covering this town, we've never been there. We don't know who the mayor is. We don't know who the fire chief is. And this is true of local media. You may be responsible for covering an area, but you're in a similar position in some cases as the national media, because there are parts of the community that you aren't familiar with. They aren't part of a regular beat, and you don't have the staff or the time necessary to cover these things. And so that's sort of what your local journalists are up against when they start, when something like this happens, and having contacts like Andy and these sorts of things are very important. But I just wanted to give you a taste of what it's like in those first couple of hours and days when you're covering a situation like this.
Thanks. Mm-hmm. Nick is our third and final speaker. Nick Messenger is an economist, and he was blogging throughout the disaster. He works, he's a doctoral candidate in economics at Ohio State University. Nick, please.
Yeah. So a little strange for an economist, I think, to be at the Science Writers Conference. But one of the things with this story is that it actually has now impacted policy. And I think the folks like us who work in the policy world, we like to think we're the movers and shakers with this really elegant research that drives policy discussions. But actually, we are pretty much driven by events that occur and are covered by the media, because that's what the folks with votes in Congress and votes in the state house respond to the most. And so when an event like this happens, you suddenly are faced almost similarly, where we had not prepared a bunch of research on federal and state level railway policy. And we had not really thought too much in our organization about how the economic impact of what's being shipped on rail through our region. The organization, the think tank I'm with, we focus on Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And so very similarly, you wake up and suddenly everything is about railway policy and the economic consequences of this environmental disaster. And you're kind of sitting there saying, okay, where do we start, right? What are the questions that are going to need answered, and how can we contribute? And that's kind of where the blogging came from in the early stages. Was, well, there's just going to be a lot of information out there. And so how can we use our platform with a regional think tank to just elevate a lot of the journalism? And so really what we were doing was aggregating all of the journalism, trying to say, hey, we're going to link out to 25 different stories on this. We're going to try to summarize and provide all of this citation to just use our network to kind of disseminate a lot of the on-the-ground reporting. And that kind of had some challenges too. I had actually never really been as reliant on journalism in covering a policy kind of research approach as I was with the East Palestine disaster. And we were chatting earlier that there were some challenges where my first thought was, well, there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of conflicting information. I'll go read, 40 sources and articles from different journalists so that, a person in our general public network doesn't have to. And I'll use my research skills to kind of distill common information between stories. And then you start realizing that certain aspects of these stories are all being traced back to a quote from one individual, right? And it's 40 different stories from the same source. And so I think there really was a complexity to this that started to appear that folks in the policy world, not just myself, had not really thought through what it's like to be a journalist getting this information from primary sources. And so that became a really large challenge in talking about and answering questions about, well, our senators in Ohio proposed a change to federal railway legislation. what's the history of that? Why are we changing it? What's this law look like? Suddenly, these were the questions we were getting asked, right? Is why didn't somebody do this before? Why didn't Obama do this? Why didn't Trump do this? Why isn't Biden doing this? Why is my congressman saying the water tests are fine, and somebody else's congressman in Pennsylvania is saying they aren't fine, and we should be concerned. And so, as an economist, I think the place that I've spent the most time in the last months since the disaster is thinking and trying to just talk more about how we estimate the true cost of disasters like this, because that's a really common thread. When you have people still living in hotels, when you have people who are facing long-term health complications, where that science of these chemicals are really going to manifest in 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And then you have the railway company saying, well, we're going to pay, don't worry, we're going to pay for the cost of the disaster, we're going to clean it all up. As an economist, that cost is a lot bigger than the market cost, right? It's a lot bigger than paying the folks who are out digging up dirt and shipping it out of the county. It's a lot bigger than hiring people to come spray water into the air, even if that wasn't really maybe what they should have been doing. But it's a lot of non-market costs to people's lives and health long-term that are really difficult to estimate. And I can talk more about that as we kind of go on.
Yeah. I mean, I think the through line here is that it was more complicated than anyone really anticipated. And I can speak as, ProPublica, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a national news organization. We do some international as well, but it focuses mainly on long investigations. And so we could step back a little bit and dig a little deeper. I did one piece about testing in East Palestine that, we can get into more a little bit later, but suffice it to say, it was not a simple piece and things were not as they appeared. And it was the kind of thing where I've been doing this reporting I've been reporting a long time, and it was a complicated one for me and for my editors. We went back, we had questions for the EPA. Overall, the piece was about air monitoring that was being done by a company called CTEH, which it turned out was a consultant for Norfolk Southern. And so you realize that there are just all these sort of conflicting tensions in the relationships between the testers who were a CTEH, but they were accompanied by EPA. And CTEH, again, is a company that's hired by Norfolk Southern. And it turned out when I looked into it, has a long history of both doing this kind of monitoring for rail companies in just this kind of situation where you have a toxic crash, but also using the results of that monitoring to defend the company later in court. So it becomes this very complicated, tangled mess. Anyway, but let's go ahead with some questions and we can talk more about all of this. Andy, when I was in East Palestine and I saw the little fountains everywhere, which I thought were, I guess I'm just jarred by your suggestion that these aerations, these sort of sprinklers that were set up all over East Palestine were perhaps done so in error. Before we kind of go into other questions, I want to clarify, is that actually what you're suggesting, that was a mistake?
So the officials did it on purpose to get the contamination out of the creeks, but the aerators and the aeration units sometimes were placed next to people's homes, and the chemicals, you've seen it, they're sometimes 10 feet away is the window. And so they were blowing contamination and the vapors would go in and get people sick and then they would leave. So
clearly this was a source of contamination for people, and so in hindsight, would you say that was a decision made in error? That was a bad decision and they shouldn't have done that?
I would say that the government agencies that are entrusted with protecting the public were responsible for protecting the public. And so if you're going to blow contamination to the air, you need to make sure that doesn't harm the public that's in the space. Right. And so I think you found yourself in this role of being a trusted scientist who could give who was willing to and able to give an alternative perspective to that of the EPA. And the EPA, so for just some context, what happens in these kinds of disasters is
you have the company is required to oversee to lead the response, but the EPA basically monitors it. They oversee it, right? But so it's sort of you have the EPA and Norfolk Southern in this situation working together, but again, it's somewhat complicated. So for instance, people, when these folks would come to do air monitoring, they wouldn't, they would present themselves as the EPA, and the residents didn't always understand who was there and who they represented. But I'm hoping you can tell us all more, Andy, about the problems you saw in the official response that was overseen by the EPA, particularly in terms of testing and providing information about testing to the public in East Palestine.
So when we arrived on site 3 weeks after the disaster and found contamination was outside the containment area, and in water fountains, aeration units blowing, and you could smell the odors, and people are talking about illness, that kind of piqued our interest that maybe there's something wrong. And we started meeting with households and they were desperate. They were desperate. They were of all political persuasions, just desperate for somebody to help them. They did not care who would come in to help them. We then went and reviewed the water testing data that started getting posted online 3 weeks after the disaster. So the state didn't put any of the drinking water testing data online for 3 weeks, but told everybody, don't worry about it, it's safe, we've tested it. And then when they started putting it online, we realized that they weren't actually testing for all the chemicals that were spilled on the train that they found in the creeks. So there were just a number of different incongruities between what they were saying and the response.
When you realized that they were not testing for all the chemicals they should have been, what did you do? Did you tell people?
So initially, I reach out generally to government agencies and think that they've messed up and maybe they can correct it quickly. So I reached out to the county health department. They told me thanks, but we talked to the EPA, reached out to EPA, didn't hear back from Region 5. I talked to the state of Ohio governor's office. I reached out 3 times, they didn't respond.
And then what?
And then I said, if I can't find a way in, I'm just gonna put it on the table and then talk about it publicly.
Okay, and so, and I'm not saying that was wrong, I think it was important, but that I think is like an important fissure to kind of identify in this situation. It was pretty early on, right? When was this that you made that decision?
It was 3 weeks after.
Right, and so imagine you're a resident of East Palestine and you've been told your water is safe, and here's this professor, looks credible, who's saying, wait a minute, they haven't actually tested for all the chemicals that were on the train. And so that is the seed of mistrust, right? Oh my gosh, here we have a problem and the authorities are not properly dealing with it. So Stephanie, there still are so many questions unanswered, swirling, and you were thrust into the middle of it. So can you talk a little bit about the mistrust you encountered, and whether, why you think it was there and what it was like to encounter it?
Sure. First, I want to respond to what Andy was describing. They weren't just saying it's safe. They were on social media, like Mike DeWine's like sipping glasses of tap water on social media, like they did that during Flint too, where they're like, oh, it's totally safe. They're having like a tap water sipping party. And the public is watching this, especially the people in East Palestine, and they're like, I can smell these chemicals. And so this just doesn't pass. I'm not a scientist, but this doesn't pass my common sense test. And I think that's one of the sources of distrust, not just of the government, but also of the media, right? So we go into the community and people are asking questions of us, like they're desperate. And they're asking questions like, is my house safe? Can I let my kids play in the backyard? What about I raise chickens. I have farm animals. Are they safe to eat? Am I gonna hurt other people if I slaughter these animals? Right? And we are struggling to get answers to these questions. In many cases, they don't exist yet if they ever get answered. But also we're having a difficult time finding members of the public who will, go on the record initially, right? Those first couple of days, they're kind of like, okay, go away. That changes very, very, very quickly. The public almost immediately realizes we're not going to get answers from the establishment. And so what we're going to do is we are going to talk to the media all the time, which is awesome. And so I'll tell you about Sarah Gump. She lives along the train tracks about 1.5 miles from the crash site. The train went past her house. She lives there with her husband and her 2 children. And what she says to me is, we're talking on the phone, and she says, my mom told me, believe nothing that you hear and only half of what you see. And if you just watched Wednesday, the Netflix show, it was a quote on there. It's also been attributed to Edgar Allan Poe and Benjamin Franklin. I mean, this is a quote that's been around a while, but that is the attitude that she has generally to the media, to the government, and this distrust just sort of exists. And unfortunately, I think it's bad fame well earned in a lot of cases, because there are cases where we haven't, we do our best, but we haven't really done our best. We haven't always succeeded. And so I think in some cases, the distrust comes from previous experience. This wasn't her first environmental disaster. She ironically moved to East Palestine when the town that she was in experienced a different kind of environmental disaster. And so she had been through this before, and her mode of collecting information was mostly word of mouth from people that she knew in the community. And she got everything from Facebook groups and what I would consider hardcore disinformation outlets on YouTube. But she had a very effective fact-checking system that included this network in the community, and she became an excellent source. And her information was usually very reliable. And so I think the information, the distrust came from experience.
Yeah, and I want to add one thing about the distrust that I saw was when I was talking to people, on many occasions, I talked to people who themselves felt ill. They were either feeling ill at the time or they had felt ill.
Yes.
And the EPA was consistently saying, we do not see that there is any reason for you to feel ill. Not those words, but that message, right? And when people know if they feel ill, they know, right? Yeah. And so that seemed like this really, like people were, so they felt gaslit, right? I feel sick. But for us as journalists, so, we can't control what the EPA says, but part of what we're able to bring in as primary sources are the people who feel sick, yes. And I had people who would whip up their inhaler, or they'd show me the results from, I went to the ER and look what they said, because they felt not heard and seen and believed, yes. Right? And so I feel like this is part of why I feel like this is such an important and interesting story, is like, in this case, it's absolutely clear that one of the sources has to be, the people who are saying they feel sick. And, yes. and again, some of them can prove it their various ways, but they feel, they feel sick.
We talk to people with rashes. We talk to people with nosebleeds. We talk to people who were at the medical clinics, who would go and say, I'm here because I'm getting dry heaves and I'm getting nosebleeds every time I go into my house. Yes. And they would say, well, we've checked your vital signs and you're fine.
Yep. And we've checked your, and as to, the testing results, here the company Norfolk Southern had a map, I don't know if it's still there, on their disaster response page, that had little green dots everywhere they had checked the air. And so, as Andy said, the equipment they were using was not actually able to pick up all the air pollution. And nevertheless, they had a map that was essentially a sea of green dots. And so it said, all good, all good. And people were like, this is not my experience of life. So it creates this like disconnect, right? So Nick, you were nearby at times, right? And you were, as you said, closely monitoring local media. So I'm wondering how the media coverage differed from, you know, area to area, and if you see that as important.
Yeah, so I'm based in Columbus, and so a little bit outside of the immediate geography, but spent some time in Cincinnati and in some of the river towns along the Ohio River, and talked with folks there, and just heard from other folks in the public policy and elected officials that we have relationships in those parts of the state. And I think once you remove from the immediacy of the folks who are suffering and the immediate impact and at risk, what the media narrative started to turn into outside of the immediate disaster was really two questions. Who should we blame? And how I have a railroad by my house, what is going through that railroad crossing, and how do I prevent a derailment that poisons my community, right? It's not that folks didn't empathize and sympathize with the folks in East Palestine, but I think the media coverage, as you've got further geographically from the disaster, starts to think about these questions. In terms of who to blame, that's a really interesting one. I'm sure it's a shock to everybody who's a journalist that we live in highly polarized times. And even if you have really hard scientific facts, almost the last people you want to say true scientific facts would be like Joe Biden and Donald Trump, right? Because immediately people retreat into their own kind of political sphere of biases. So you immediately had this blame game start to appear. And I started to see articles, particularly from the national media, but it trickled down into some of the large conglomerate media companies in the state of, well, this was really, you know, the tanker cars weren't double, layered, and all these conversions were supposed to happen from the Obama administration rule change. And then Donald Trump's administration did an analysis of the cost and reversed the rule after Norfolk Southern and all the railways lobbied. So this blame game starts to happen, right? And that starts to become very difficult because these really complicated rulemaking processes, right, are starting to get distilled to two sentences that start with the Obama administration or the Trump administration. And immediately folks in Cincinnati or Columbus or kind of further away are starting to just form their own, oh, yep, I know who I'm blaming right now, right, as soon as you talk to them. The second piece about how do you prevent it gets a little harder, because that's where you actually have to know the truth about what happened in the first place. And you have to know the science of what happened in the first place. And you have to know how the railway company policy operates. When should they have stopped the car? How were they monitoring? What are the safety features of the rail cars? And so those two questions started to pop up in different places. And going back to the point on distrust, what you started to see, even in places far away from the immediate spill, like Cincinnati, is you had, the governor having a water sipping tea party saying the water in East Palestine's fine. We're cleaning everything up. You can drink your water right there where the crash happened. And then you have the Cincinnati Waterworks turn off its Ohio River intake and say, well, we're not going to have water come into the city water system from the Ohio River until this plume of chemicals that the governor is talking about has passed by. And so immediately people in Cincinnati go, well, wait a minute. I'm going to go buy bottled water. I'm not going to drink that. I'm nervous now about this, right? And you kind of start to have that disconnect where you're hearing that it's fine to drink the water out of the tap right there in East Palestine, but now the water company in Cincinnati is shutting the water off and not going to pull Ohio River water, right? Or the water intake in West Virginia, some of their water systems temporarily closed off their river intakes as well. And so really coming back to the distrust, when actions and statements start to feel disconnected, whether you're right there on the ground in East Palestine or you're in the broader region, it really starts to turn up the skepticism dial for pretty much everybody. And suddenly you're in this just kind of quagmire of competing facts, political polarization, trying to assign blame, and you don't really trust any of the folks making decisions because what they're saying and what they're doing don't really line up from your kind of common sense perspective. And so it wasn't just a problem right there with residents who were suffering the most, but that distrust became a regional phenomenon, and I think even a national phenomenon by the end of the month or so after the disaster.
Yeah, and you could argue it's not over.
No, I think it's also kind of there with everything, right?
Yeah.
But it's particularly, I think, felt when folks are on the ground suffering. And
Yes.
they're kind of at the epicenter of this broader kind of consequence of our extreme era of factless mistrust.
Yeah. No, Andy, in this era of factless mistrust, you're generating data, right? You're taking water samples from East Palestine, you're taking them back to your university and you're analyzing them. I'm really curious, one, about when you got results, how you put them out, and whether you think that system worked. Was that a good way of doing it in retrospect? At this point, looking back on it.
So our first creek water samples from Sulphur Run and Leslie Run, the two major creeks that were impacted, didn't match what the Ohio EPA had directed Norfolk Southern to sample and analyze. And so as a scientist, the first thing is, okay, I must have messed up, right? Like, so now you got to double vet and triple vet and check everything. And
what was the difference, if you briefly could explain it?
Oh, in some cases, we found 10,000 ppb of 2-butoxyethanol, and I think Ohio EPA found 200.
And is that a chemical people should be concerned about? That
was one of the chemicals that was pure on the train that spilled, that does cause acute health impacts if you have contact with it. But then in other times, our results were, 100 parts per billion of something, and theirs were 400. And so we had differences. And then backing it up, we asked the EPA for, and the other agencies, for a copy of their sampling plans, because the government agencies have to approve these industries to proceed out into the community before they're allowed to proceed. So we knew they existed. They didn't reply. They didn't give us information. And so we basically chalked it up to the heterogeneity, just how contaminated it was. And we must have picked up pockets of contamination where they didn't. And one of the challenges with disaster response in the US for chemical disasters is that there is no law that compels any of the agencies to work with anybody else other than themselves.
Right.
And so they don't have to respond, and in many cases they didn't respond. And so in absence of that information, we do what we can to try to figure out what's going on.
But how did you put your results out there? Did you put your results out there? And what, I'm asking, for folks in the audience who are going to, covering science, sometimes, I think this happened with us. I want to know what you found, and you can't tell me because your paper is not published yet, right? And that happens sometimes. So is that, so are you putting out this stuff by publishing it? Are there other ways of disseminating it? Should there be other ways of disseminating?
So the really critical, acute health risk issues that we identified, the exposures that were happening indoors, the CTH contractor taking a sample, finding nothing, and then actually the building owner did their own sampling without telling CTTH, did suma canister sampling, and then found contamination above safe limits in their building that CTH just said everything's fine. And so we do go publicly with that, as long as we have consent of the parties.
But did you go public with the results of your own testing? And how did you do that?
Most of it. And we did that through community meetings, and we shared that information. Mm-hmm. And we spend all the time to talk and answer any question that people have.
Yep.
We also wrote letters to elected officials, and because we wanted to build a record. It's one thing to have a conversation with them in a closed room, and then they don't acknowledge that it happened.
And for reporters who might find themselves in similar situations going forward, how do you want them to engage with you? What's the best way, for you to work with reporters to get your results out there?
I would say maintain the skepticism that you have, but exert more of it at the government agencies, because just because they're a government agency does not mean that they know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And don't parrot their talking points in the interview with the scientist. We saw great this morning with Juice DeGao from CU Boulder when he talked about indoor air quality, and he's been effective at communicating, and that's partly because of how the media has engaged with his research.
Yeah, and I want to take a little moment to talk about my reporting process with the EPA for that one story I was just mentioning. So for local reporters, especially for young reporters, sometimes they have not done anything except we'd like your response. And then they get the response and you go, okay, bye, I'll put it in the story. Well, you know, I've never really, I mean, I tend not to do that, but boy, did my editors push me on this story. I think I called the EPA 15 times. And I said, that's not what we're hearing. This does not track with what people are telling me. So one of the sticking points was people told me that that CTEH sometimes showed up without EPA folks, you know, present. And, you know, and I had a recording someone had given me of the testers saying, we're from the EPA, but in fact, they were, you know, EPA and CTEH, that kind of thing. So it was just a good reminder of how important it is to go back and foresters, you know, it's uncomfortable. It is unpleasant. Nobody wants, you know, and you can't believe it. You're going back to the public information officer and you're saying, I know you answered this 5 times, but here's why I don't believe you. and you're pushing them and it's hard, but it actually turned out to be necessary. I want, and Stephanie, you want to comment on this? I also want to hear what you're going to be doing going forward. So, but go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I was really critical of the media, and I earlier, and I am, because I think our mission is sacred, and I see a lot of room for improvement. But I have to tell you how fast a team of journalists will learn that, and it is a very it gives, I mean, like, as an editor, when you watch, you know, your early career journalists go out and just really like, that doesn't make any sense, sir. I'm going to ask you that same question again and again and again, because the answer that you gave isn't satisfactory. Because of the other reporting that I've already done, it really, you know, it just brightens your heart, you know. And so, you know, that sort of thing is happening, and you can see the effects on future stories, and especially in terms of like environmental reporting. I think that this is crucial. You have to understand too the deadline pressures that some of the reporters are under. So like in a breaking news situation, you send that reporter out, they get a bite, right? Just 12 seconds that they pull from a press conference or an interview. All right, so in 15 minutes, you're going to be on the BBC. And then after that, you're going to feed that to NPR National. And that's going to be, you know, so
yeah,
you've got 5 minutes to put together a coherent thought using that bite that you just pulled that's 12 seconds long. And you're going to have to report on this topic like that for the next 7 days. So.
We're going to open it up to the audience for questions, but I want to just piggyback on one thing that Stephanie just said about, you know, when you're pushing back against authorities like the EPA, again, using politely, you're saying, based on my own reporting, and here is where, you know, you can say, I talked to, you know, I have video, I have 3 people telling me this, I have pieces of paper they've given me showing me, and you know, this is, you know, here's why this couldn't possibly be. So yeah.
And that's why people like Sarah Gump get so important, because Sarah Gump's texting me videos of people throwing rocks in that creek. The one that went around on social media, and she's like, hey, did you see this? And somebody throws a rock in the creek and all this chemical just goes like this. And at the same time, they're like, oh no, it's fine. It's all cleaned up. Don't worry about it.
And sure.
You know, and that's very helpful.
Yeah.
I would want to add the same, I think, advice applies on some of the things like talking to Norfolk Southern, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And thinking around, you know, as an economist, thinking around things like the cost of the disaster.
Right.
You know, I see a lot of reporting around, you know, oh, it's going to cost $375 million to clean up. And that's kind of the headline, right, of this really large number. But as an economist, I kind of say, well, how did their economists come up with
what is that?
And what's included in that number? And you know, I don't necessarily believe that number. And so pushing back on some of those pieces as well is super important.
So I do think we have a microphone, and anybody who wants to ask questions, please come and ask questions.
Andy, a quick question for you. you talked about the devices that were approved, that were used by this consulting agency, and you said they were incapable of finding or measuring contaminants. And when the building owner, they themselves went and measured the contaminants, they found different results. What was wrong with these devices? And you also quickly talked about indecipherable documents. What was indecipherable about it?
So let me jump to the indecipherable first. So there were water testing reports that were issued to households that the Norfolk Southern contractor created. And on the back, in the front side, it basically says something to the effect that we found no levels of harmful contaminants. And then you flipped it over to the side that had like the actual data, and the level that they could detect at was actually higher than the level of health concern for 29 of the 100 and something chemicals that they listed on the back page. And so we then contacted Administrator Reagan and said, hey, look, on your watch, this is happening. You need to exert your authority to like fix this, because we were starting, people were sending us their lab reports and asking us questions and asking us to do something about it. Flipping to the other side, if journalists, if you go to a hazmat site, you need to be very, very careful, and you need to find training on, what things are. I was exposed when I was there, and I got a headache, and that was like the first experience that something was really wrong. There are these things called photoionization detectors that firefighters use, and they're just general detectors. They use it in industry, and just to see if there's VOCs in the air. But these things, even though they report out a number on this computer screen, and it might say the exact chemical that it thinks it's detecting, that number we have seen in other industries can be off completely, or just like by a factor of 1,000 to 10,000. And so we talked to NIOSH, we talked to these other agencies, and they do not consent to basically using these devices to determine if a workplace is safe or not. Right. You actually have to you grab the air with a SUMA canister, a stainless steel canister, you send it to a laboratory, and then they do a workup of all the individual chemicals out of there. These handheld devices were used in a way that they were never meant to be used for, and the EPA approved and signed the plan that Norfolk Southern submitted with CTEH to go into all these buildings and use that device for.
Thank you all for being here. You touched on this, but with each of your professions in mind, were there things that you learned along the way that you would do differently if you had to tell this story or participate in this process again? I'm curious, like, would you have done the same thing you did the first time?
Okay.
Yeah, I learned a lot. I learned a lot from watching, I was talking about that disinformation YouTube channel. So Sarah told me about it and I was like, ugh. But I watched hours of this horrible news coverage, and I learned an incredible amount. One of the reasons that I think that distrust against the mainstream media has become entrenched is that they don't think that we are asking the questions that they want answers to. They think we're talking to them and then just like going away and then coming back with some answer that doesn't really answer the question that they asked of us. And what I was watching, I was watching this channel. I'm like, why are people, they're not getting any answers that we're not getting. Why are people paying attention to this? And it was like hours and hours and hours of this guy. And he's like, what are you hiding?
Yeah.
Are the homes safe? And the people aren't answering the question, because the questions there aren't answers to these questions. But what I learned was, let them hear you ask the question. And so when we're producing we're radio, when we're producing our pieces, I let them hear us ask the question. If they don't answer it, I'm not going to say so-and-so declined to answer the question. I'm going to let them hear us ask the question and them not answer it, so that people see that we're doing our job. That is a good question. We honor your question and we asked it. So that's one way.
Andy, anything you do differently?
I'm still struggling with how to respond differently. This has been the most difficult disaster that I've been a part of, the most sad disaster that I've been a part of, because at multiple steps along the way, the agencies had information in front of them and chose not to act in the best interest of the public. And so there was something going on with this disaster. And I say this in a way where, you know, some people, when they make bad decisions, at some point they make it the right one. And we just kept seeing in this that we couldn't figure out the cycle about what was driving those decisions and how to break that cycle so that people could, you know, move on.
And from my perspective, I actually hope to do more reporting there. And I keep thinking, because what I feel like my big regret is that I didn't have more time, because it's still going on. Like the problems are stretching out in this tragic way. And I feel like it needs time and attention to like actually still try to untangle all the pieces of what's going on, economic, scientific. And so I'm very much hoping to be able to do that, to take the time.
I think in a lot of ways, for my profession as an economist, our role is really just starting. One of the things that good economics uses data. Unfortunately, we don't get the benefit of laboratory data to go out and test economic outcomes. We need time. And so to answer questions like, well, what is the true loss value in ecotourism, fishing, you know, people who use those creeks to fish and draw customers in for local restaurants and shops, the lost value of people's homes. Nobody wants to buy a home near a disaster site, right? And or maybe the soil in the backyard is contaminated and I'll buy it, but I want to buy it for less money than it's previously was worth, right? Those types of questions get answered by economists, but you have to get 3 or 4 years of market data about home sales, or you have to monitor multiple tourism fishing seasons to see how those changes actually manifest. So in a lot of ways, I think the role that our profession will play is kind of a second phase of studying and thinking about the disaster.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Erin Douglas. I'm a reporter for the Texas Tribune, and I covered the Intercontinental Terminals Company chemical fire in 2019, and then I subsequently did a lot of reporting after that, finding out that the air quality testing that had been done by CTEH, same company, was not the same results as EPA was getting in their own air monitoring on a van, which they then did not release to the public until we reported on it. So I just wanted to ask about one thing that I think about a lot is this sort of immediate disaster reporting that we're doing on a chemical or industrial disaster. And a lot of times the only number that you have in that moment is from whatever company they've contracted to go out there immediately. And how do you think about reporting that number? Because on one hand, I don't want to elevate a number that might be wrong or might be misleading to the public. On the other hand, everyone is asking, is it safe? Is the air safe? As soon as you get the results, you want to report those results. Like, how do you sort of balance that difficulty in not really knowing if the data that you're getting from the officials is the correct data and there's no other data available?
Yeah. I mean, this is haunting. This is what keeps every one of us up at night, especially in the early days of responding to a crisis. I think it's incumbent on editors to make sure that your reporter, I mean, like you couldn't not report it, right? Like, I don't think you have a choice when it first comes out. But I do think that your very first email says, where is the number from? And, you know, who collected it and how did you get it? And what is your relationship between the people that collected it and your agency? How long it takes you to find that out? How long did it took you published that story in March, right?
Yeah.
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 But it came out. So, you know.
Yeah. And there was so much. That story, the editors cut a huge section because they were like, we don't have the time to get to the bottom of it, right. You know, but anyway, I also think qualifying it. Yeah. So, you know, here's what I have, but, you know, and you just say all the questions and the uncertainties, and maybe even we anticipate this number may change, or, you know, like early estimates, you know, or something.
And is there any records or things that you would ask for immediately when something like this happens, just based off of your previous reporting?
I mean, you're obviously the NTSB report, right? And which, there wasn't much in the beginning. And then, it turned out that the command central or whatever involved lots, officials, county officials from both Pennsylvania and Ohio, state officials from both states, and EPA folks. So it turns out there was actually no shortage of people to talk to, and some of them were willing to talk. So, just every, of course, you're going to have better chances of getting real conversations out of the county level people. And that did happen for me too. So yeah. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for all your work. My name is Michelle Ramaposha. I'm with the Union of Concerned Scientists. My question is about I seem to remember vaguely that there was a sort of campaign on TikTok and some reels and that brought to light all of these discrepancies. And I was curious to what extent you gained any information from those citizen reporters who are sounding the alarm on this.
Stephanie?
A lot. From them, from sources in the field, from other media. I mean, everybody, the media, you're competitive, right? But we're also a mission-driven group of people. So there are times where we talk to each other and, hey, do you have a good source on this? That sort of thing. But a good amount, a lot.
And I'm just gonna, I know that we're almost out of time, so I'm gonna move to the next question. Sorry.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Hannah Webster. I'm a health reporter at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. So we've been covering this and still are. And I've been to East Palestine and been on the ground and chatted with sources. So I appreciate your perspective. I'm wondering if you can talk about the balance of doing this reporting alongside social media. And you mentioned social media a little bit, thank you. In addition to valid source experiences, there's also, as you know, lots of mis and disinformation that was coming out pretty quickly. And I want to know about how you navigated the extreme language that was coming out of social media and some media outlets. Like there was one article that said that a town was nuked, which implies radioactivity. And there was one Twitter thread that said like a bombed cyclone train. And just like, do you address that at all, or do you just do the work?
We mostly do the work.
Yeah, I didn't at all. I mean, I hear you, but yeah.
I mean, there were things we'd fact checked, like the rumor that the medical registration tag was like tracking people. So we did things like that. If they were just, if it was just totally factually wrong and we got wind of it, we could, and we talked to a local, a representative from the government. So we addressed that. But in terms of the language and things, we just did the work. Yeah.
Hi, I'll make my question brief. My name is Helen Santoro. I'm a freelance health journalist. And one of the points that was made that I find really interesting and applies to all of health journalism is data disconnect from people's experience, like lived experience in their lives. And one of the things I found that's really difficult as a reporter that's sometimes on the ground or getting tips from sources online is trying to bring that to an editor like, hey, this is not matching up. And although as journalists, our job is to be skeptical of the data, we also have time constraints, and editors don't always, they're like, well, the CDC is saying this and there's no clear data to point to back your patient's experience and sort of move past it. And I'm wondering from a journalistic perspective and like editorial perspective, your advice on dealing with situations like that.
Well, I would just say briefly, this is a kind of amazing, unique experience, this particular disaster, because not only did you have the residents talking about what they experienced, you had, as Andy said, the scientists, a team from CDC, and people on all sides of the issues. So it was like, it was not your typical thing. I feel like I'm not exactly answering your question, but it was sort of this amazing situation where there was no question about that this disconnect was real.
I think when that disconnect happens, we report both.
Yes, yes.
A quick question to add to the discrepancy discussion. When there's this discrepancy in the data and from what people are experiencing, it feels like the onus is on individuals or researchers like you to go and find the answers and find those discrepancies. How difficult is that? I mean, is it a very expensive process? Is it very hard for people on the ground to just go? I mean, it feels like, okay, if it was an easy thing to do, people would go and do these independent results on their own, but probably it's not easy at all. Can you help us understand that?
So we spent about $120,000 without a source to back us. And that was taking samples and processing and analyzing it and doing that on the cheap for transportation. It is expensive and there is no funding mechanism to support that. There are government grants, but you have to justify to the government agencies that it's an issue, and then it's $50,000 or less generally. So people aren't doing it, and you're not seeing teams go in and help initially because there's just no money for it. And so you just see a coalition of the willing do it.
Right, and sometimes you have this, you know, a citizen journalist or a citizen scientist who go in and actually, even if they're trying to be helpful, are sometimes misinterpreting or misreporting what they found. And that did happen in East Palestine. You had some dioxin report results that were not accurately reported, and yet were broadcast on television on numerous stations and reported out. So, you know, it's a problem.
All right, those of you in the room, hang tight. We have one more thing, but this concludes the Zoom webinar portion. So let's thank this amazing panel. I wish we could keep going.